Hey everybody, Dr. Hassan, how's it going? I'm disheartened and angry, all sorts of things about what's happening in the late May of 2022, everything that happened with Uvalde and how it portends, a whole bunch of other not so great things on the horizon. For the purposes of this class, it makes us well advised to talk about gun control next, which we certainly should and will. And yeah, I'm just going to reiterate that I hope one of the things that we do in here is inspire you to take some sort of action in a way that you see fit. I will say that as far as things about how the class is going to run go, so I have a YouTube channel with this video and all the other videos, and I don't know if you know anything about YouTube, but you can do analytics, and I can see who's watching, not specific people, but I can see how often people are watching. And the average is not high. So I'm not, mad about it or whatever. It's just these prepping for this class, it's my job, of course, but there's different amounts of time that I can put into it. And if I put in a lot of time into it, and put in a lot of time to making these videos, which, that's kind of what I'm talking about right now, is should I be doing that? I probably shouldn't be putting a lot of time into it if nobody's watching it. So we'll see how it goes. If you all are doing well on the quizzes and the analytics are such where they are, then that implies that you're cheating. I'm not accusing you. I'm not aware of cheating. I'm also not a freaking idiot. So I'm just going to use common sense, right? If I look at the video and nobody's really watching and then everyone's getting hundreds on the quizzes or whatever, then I have to change up my approach, and it's this song and dance that I don't, really want to do, but I have to do it. Again, I hope my tone is not one where you think I'm angry about it. I'm not. I'm just sort of airing to you how things are going and how I'm thinking about how things are going. So if that situation continues where nobody's watching the videos and, I think cheating's going on, then I'm going to have to change the approach midstream, blah, 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 blah. So just be on the lookout for it, especially if you're someone who's actually watching this. Okay, so this unit was brought on by the leaking of a draft decision by a Supreme Court Justice Sam Alito, within which he indicated that Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned 5-4 sometime in the near future. So I misspoke last time because I said it was recently overturned. I misspoke when I did the course introduction video. It hasn't been overturned yet, but by all accounts, it's going to be. And so that's what brought this on. And I think it's a useful thing to talk about, not only because of its recency, but also because it addresses these issues in a way that I want you to think about them, which is, as I spoke about in the introductory video, I want you to be thinking about the relationship between the moral questions that we're, of course, thinking about in this class. For example, is abortion moral or immoral on some particular occasion or not? And more political questions related to how a society as a whole should be structured. So that's one of the nice things about talking about this issue, is it brings that into greater relief. Now, another thing, just by way of setup, because of how I do these videos, it's sort of odd to do a video where I want the class to be about you developing your own point of view, because the best way to have you develop your own point of view is in a discussion, and this is not that. And the way that I do my classes, generally speaking, is I approach them in a kind of discussion-based way, and I can't do that here. So one of the things that I thought of doing and can do on some occasions is sort of give you both sides of an issue and present it in a neutral way, where I present one side, present its arguments, and then I present another opposing side and present its arguments. I mean, depending on what we talk about, I will do that. But I can't really do that across the board in this unit, okay? Not because the issues I'm talking about are not controversial, because they are, but it's just that a lot of the controversy involves, as you'll see, arguments where on one side, it's just one side has a sort of basic handle on reality, and the other one, even though it's controversial, does not have a basic handle on reality. And so I can't really present you with a sort of neutral perspective where I pretend like there's legitimate arguments on both sides, when you look at an opposing side and you examine their arguments, they're just nutty. Okay, so I'm not going to do that here. Okay, always anyway. I will say that as far as like the issue of abortion and like whether or not a particular act of abortion is or is not right or wrong on some particular occasion, that is controversial, and there are good arguments on both sides. Just for the sake of discussion, I think the moderate position, which says that abortion sometimes is okay and sometimes is not okay, it's probably the correct one. That shouldn't surprise you, right? So extreme pro-life positions, as they're oftentimes put, or extreme pro-choice positions, those are both difficult to defend. So I do think the issue of whether or not to have an abortion on a particular occasion is controversial. But I don't think the sort of framing of the issue that I'm going to give here in terms of the rights of women and how women have been oppressed throughout society, I don't think that's controversial. So I'm not going to pretend like it is. Okay. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to present a sort of one-sided view of things because I don't think the other side has much of a leg to stand on. You might disagree. That's fine. And I guess part of the problem is we can't have a discussion on that point. But the other thing to say is I do think that the article that I had you read, I do think that's controversial. You can agree, for example, that women's rights is an issue, and I think it clearly is, and disagree about how to frame the response to it. And Sherwin has a sort of feminist response to things, and that is controversial. It's not obvious why that has to be the response. But do you see the controversy lies in how you address the problems of women's rights? The controversy isn't whether or not women have been discriminated and are currently discriminated, because they obviously are. Okay, so that's just sort of by way of clarification here. I'm going to give you one side of the political issue because I think it is sort of obviously that way. And I'm going to not address the controversy about individual acts of abortion because I think there is that controversy. But I will talk about Sherwin's solution because I do think it is controversial, and I want you to think about whether she's right or wrong and why. Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right, so let's dive in with this sort of discussion of the relationship between the morality of abortion and the sort of broader political issue. So the first thing to just sort of get at with what I'm talking about here, when I say that, there's a relationship between politics and morality, is you have to understand that there's nothing inconsistent at all about saying that someone has a legal, or if you like, a political right to do something immoral. I mean, all sorts of examples come to mind. You might think that adultery is immoral, for example. I'm assuming you do, right? But it's at least a separate question whether or not you should think that adultery is illegal, right? Now, sometimes when I say this, people are like, yeah, it should be, off with their heads. Okay, fine, that can be your view, but it's at least a discussion that we need to have. Even just because it's immoral does not make it so that it's obviously illegal, right? And so the question of the legality of abortion is way more complicated than the question of whether or not it's moral or immoral on particular occasions. So again, I'm going to operate, given the sort of framing of this issue, I'm going to operate under the assumption that it's sometimes moral and sometimes not. But that is not obvious. I mean, I'm open to having, I'm open to the idea that there are potential arguments for a strong pro-life position or potential arguments for a strong pro-choice position. Okay, I do think that's controversial. I do think whether or not abortion as a moral act is or is not wrong is controversial. But for the purposes of this unit, because of how I want to frame it within the context of this recent imminent overturning of Roe, I am going to set that aside. So let me put it this way. Suppose you did think that abortion was almost always immoral. Suppose, just for the sake of argument, that you did think that. Then one of the things you might do is say, precisely for that reason, it should be legal. Okay? Why? It's not that hard to understand. When you legalize something, you regulate it. You bring education about it, right? You normalize it, right? Which makes it less rebellious, for example. Okay? And a lot of times, incidences of the thing you don't like go down. Okay? So I'm not saying that's true, but it's within the realm of possibility that the best thing for a pro-life position would be to legalize abortion, because it could, through regulation, education, normalization, actually bring the amounts of abortions down. On the flip side of it, we know that making abortion illegal does nothing to decrease it. That people still seek abortions in unsafe ways on the black market, and so on and so forth. So maybe it's a little too strong to say it does nothing, but it's naive to think that, and we'll say a little bit more about this, that by overturning Roe, and there's going to be a federal ban on the horizon after that, assuming things go a certain way politically, it's naive to think that that would decrease the incidence of abortion. That's not how it necessarily happens. A good example is in Ecuador. For example, it's illegal, but it happens all the time because there's like the equivalent of the morning after pill, or the early term version of that that's available on the black market. So abortions still happen illegally there. Anyway, okay. So right. So just keep in mind that the legal question and the moral question are very different. I mean, another example of it is marijuana use. You might think that marijuana use is highly immoral, right? Well, then you would be, advised to know that in places where it's legalized, incidences of it among youth, for example, go way down. I mean, this has been shown in like Colorado, for example. After marijuana use was legalized, youth use of marijuana decreased. And that just goes to show that the issues are more complicated, right? So someone who thinks a woman should have a right to choose can think that, and also think that that includes the right to do something wrong, because they can say it's a legal right. There's nothing inconsistent about that. The legal question and the moral question are different. I hope that that's clear. All right. So what I wanted to do is just sort of set the context for the potential imminent overturning of Roe by giving you some historical context for Roe itself. Okay. So abortion was made legal within, it's called the women's liberation movement. And it's, it's difficult to, or it's controversial to say when it exactly began. But most people think of it as starting or gaining steam around the 1960s within the context of the broader civil rights movement. But I mean, if you wanted to think about it, you could start in the late 19th century, I should say, up until 1920 when women were given the right to vote, right? But the abortion, when it was made legal by Roe v. Wade in 1973, right? That was within the context of this movement. And prior to that, like in the 50s and the 60s, and certainly before 1920, women were oppressed in a variety of ways. For example, a woman was not allowed to have a credit card of her own if she was married. She had to have the credit card put in her husband's name all the way up until 1975. So in 1974, if you were a woman and you were married, you couldn't have your own credit. And single women found it difficult to get credit up until that point. The contraception, right, the pill, right, birth control, it only became available in 1960. And prior to that, women had no ability to, no effective form of birth control that was legalized anyway. So that was as late as 1960. Up until 1968, you could still live in certain areas of the country where a woman couldn't serve on a jury. So in 1968, it was Alabama, I believe, or maybe it was Mississippi. You can look that up. Where that was when a woman being allowed to serve on a jury was allowed. Okay. The whole idea of shelters for women who were victims of domestic abuse, those came about in the 1960s. So there was sort of a normalization, a hush-hush about domestic abuse. Sherwin talks about this, right? The idea of marital rape being allowed, and so on and so forth. So all of that, right, was part of the women's liberation movement of the 1960s, which was part of the broader civil rights movement. And so you cannot understand the granting of the political right to have an abortion absent that political context. So again, I'm talking about the legal question here, separating it from the moral question of whether an abortion is right or wrong on any particular occasion. The right for a woman to have an abortion was granted within the broader context of the women's liberation movement. And so now you can see how that gives context to the current moves of this Supreme Court, because what you're seeing is a kind of conservative backlash, a reactionary backlash to these sorts of progressive movements like the civil rights movement. I mean, that happened ever since the 1980s with respect to the civil rights movement of the 60s, and we're sort of still living through the effects of that in the so-called neoliberal era, which is the era that we're living in under modern capitalism. You can see it as a reaction, broadly speaking, to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And right now you are in the context of a conservative backlash to a lot of pushes for equality with respect to women's liberation movement. Think of gay rights, think of trans rights, and how those are being overturned, those are being violated. Okay. But most recently, there have been very extreme, and I want to emphasize extreme legal attacks on abortion in some southern states. And so the overturning of Roe, the imminent overturning of it, cannot be divorced from that context. For example, in Texas right now, anyone can sue any provider that they suspect of aiding in an abortion. And that means anybody can sue anybody in that respect. So, for example, if you are a staunch pro-life person and you suspect that your neighbor down the street got an abortion from some doctor, then you can sue the doctor. I mean, it's unclear how broadly this law should be interpreted. It's sort of a wacky law in that respect, because maybe you can, in that same imagined context, sue the cousin of the woman who got the abortion for driving the woman to the clinic, for example. And so the idea, of course, is to discourage people from having abortions by subjecting them, especially providers, to lawsuits where they lose money and they go out of business as a result. That's perfectly legal right now in Texas. In Oklahoma just got a law on the books very, very recently that outlawed abortion from fertilization. Now, that's sort of interesting because they did keep perfectly legal things like the morning after pill and birth control. But they defined, despite that, they defined life as beginning not with conception, where the fertilized egg is implanted in the uterus, but with fertilization, okay, which is a few days before or a week before. Now, okay, so that's in Oklahoma, right? And so that's one of the strictest bans possible. I mean, Louisiana this didn't happen. It was thankfully reversed, but Louisiana almost made abortion murder, where they could prosecute the woman who got an abortion for murder. Political backlash prevented that from happening, but it was very close. So this is all happening right now. And if you want to know which way the political winds are blowing, a federal ban is coming. I mean, it depends on how things politically shake out. But if we get a Republican-dominated Senate, a Republican-dominated House, and a Republican president in 2024, you can rest assured that a federal ban will occur. Okay, and from there you can see, and they've talked about it. The rhetoric is such that they've talked about outlawing things like the morning after pill, things like birth control, and so on and so forth. A lot of the rhetoric of people who are leading, in Republican states is suggesting that they are wanting to take this even further, and it's because of the sort of evangelical Christian right dominating conservative politics and framing this pro-life issue. Okay, so all of that and all the rollback of women's rights is on the horizon with this decision. That should not be ignored or should not be something you don't take seriously. It's very, very serious what's going on. And when it actually does happen, when Roe is overturned, you're not going to be surprised to learn that it's going to affect poor people. And it's going to have all sorts of problematic societal consequences that people have not really fully come to grips with yet, but they definitely are coming. For half of the women who get abortions make $18,000 or less, or maybe I think it's less than $18,000 a year. So over half of the abortions that take place are from low-income folks. And that, as you know, is disproportionately, therefore, people of color. So this is going to affect people of color and poor people way more than it's going to affect wealthy people. And that's how it's always been, just to be clear, right? I mean, when a woman wanted to get an abortion and she was wealthy, she could always just fly overseas, for example, and get it in some European country. Okay? Or you can travel to a state like Massachusetts prior to this, if the federal ban doesn't come, right? And you have the money to travel and take off work. Okay? But poor folks don't necessarily have that ability. And so this law will disproportionately affect them, for sure. Okay, so I want that, all of that stuff to be sort of what contextualizes the decision. It is a rolling back of the women's rights, and it's a rolling back of the rights granted to women as part of the women's liberation movement, right? The pay gap, for example, is still disgustingly wide, right? something like 80 cents on the dollar, much less if you're a woman of color. This will definitely affect the pay gap. The pay gap will increase as a result of this for obvious reasons. Okay. So what is and this sort of sets up Sherwin's article, right? What is the relationship between abortion rights and these broader issues about women's rights? Well, it all relates to patriarchy, right? Western society, and certainly American society, has been patriarchal since its foundation, favoring the rights of wealthy white males. I mean, it's written in the Constitution. It's, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if you look at who they got that from, which is John Locke in his second treatise of government, he said life, liberty, and property. So they didn't want to put that in the Thomas Jefferson was a smart propagandist. He didn't want to put it in the Declaration of Independence, so he said pursuit of happiness. But if you look at the way that the government was structured, it was obviously designed to favor propertied white males. They were the only ones that were allowed to vote. The Senate was where all the power was originally in the Constitution, and the Senate was all wealthy white males, and the Senate was not democratically elected. It was the state legislatures who originally elected senators. So we were never meant to be a democracy at the start. If you think we were, you just are wrong. The idea is we were meant to be a kind of, one way of putting it is oligarchy, right? Because these state legislatures, they chose all the senates, and of course the state legislatures were the wealthy white males picking the other wealthy white males, making sure, right, that no one took their wealth. I mean, that's just sort of obvious that if you were wealthy, you'd want to frame the laws so that nobody can take your wealth. So as a result of that, I don't need to remind you of all the way that oppression took place. I mean, we can think about the way that, you're sitting on stolen land right now. You're standing on stolen land from indigenous peoples, slavery, right? Our country is founded on this form of oppression. It's founded on that kind of genocide, and the sort of economic development took place on the backs of slaves and indentured servants. Something like in the middle of the 19th century, something like half the population was either a slave or an indentured servant in this country. And the sort of the Industrial Revolution took place within that context. Okay, so you can see any sort of restriction of abortion, if you just want to sort of treat it in a vacuum naively, you can, but that is problematic. That is naive. Any of it should be seen within the context of that pattern of oppression of women and minorities throughout our history. Okay, and this is where, Sherwin's stuff I do think is helpful, because you can see this and it shows up in sort of implicit, you have to look for it ways, but look at how the way that the issue is framed. Oftentimes, the discourse with respect to abortion. It's the discourse relating to the so-called rights of a fetus, right? And the idea is that abortion is murder and that the fetus is a person, right? Well, so the sort of way to think about that within the context of what I'm talking about is the whole idea that a person has rights was something that the patriarchy used as a way to justify its form of oppression. Think of property rights as one obvious example. Property rights are crucial to our society's functioning. They are, central to the way that the government has been framed and the courts operate, okay, and so on and so forth. And of course, property rights are designed to be individual rights. If I, the person, work for something, then I, the person, have a right to it, and you have no right to take it away from me. So that's all should be contextualized by the patriarchy. Because if you're a wealthy white male, one of the ways you want to keep your wealth is by coming up with a philosophical system that allows you to do that. And thinking about property rights as rights of a person is one way to do that. And so the individual rights of a fetus, right, you can see them as adjacent to that same sort of thing. When you talk about individual rights, of a person and you make it about property rights, you're going to, by extension, be able to talk about the individual rights of a fetus. But of course, right, why is it indicative of patriarchy as well? Because they don't actually mean it, right? Anybody who says abortion, anybody who calls themselves pro-life, right, and we're talking about people who support the life of a fetus, right, then if they actually meant it, right, then they would have all sorts of policies in place that would support the life of the born child. It's not like an unborn child has rights, but as soon as they're born, they got to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps and fend for themselves. I mean, that's absurd, right? So the idea that it's indicative of a patriarchal society is how talk of that individual rights is fundamentally hypocritical, because if you were actually pro-life, right, then you would give that fetus an individual rights and also care about them after they were born. So anybody who has a policy that's that's anti-abortion, but doesn't do anything to help the born child, the infant, is a hypocrite, right? And the idea would be that's exactly what you would expect from a patriarchal framing of things. Hope that that's clear. So, it's a useful thing because, I want you to sort of get this skill, develop this skill, because it shows up, like it almost sounds like conspiratorial. I hope it doesn't. I hope it strikes you as beyond obvious, because it's all over the place. It's very salient. But the reason why I'm saying it now is it shows up in kind of subtle ways, including like the discourse, right? So you might not have thought that in talk of the individual rights of the fetus is indicative of patriarchy, but it is in a kind of implicit way, because you can see how if you are a patriarchal society, you would want to frame the issue where individual rights are important. Why? Because that allows you to talk about your individual rights, including your property rights, which allow you to keep the patriarchy in place. So Sherwin has some interesting arguments, right? For her policies, she approaches it from a policy issues, and I thought a lot of it was insightful, but I do also want to say that some of it is controversial, and so I hope this comes up in the discussion, and I'll try to ask at least one discussion forum question that gets at that. Okay, that allows you to sort of address the controversial aspects of her view. So if you read in that article, she says, well, okay, the reason why women do or do not have an abortion, it's extremely complex, and it's not just about morality. I mean, why don't we get real about, how life actually works? If you are somebody and you're wondering what you should do, should I have an abortion? Should I carry a child to term? Morality is one normative consideration. We talked about that in the introductory concepts video, or I should say the much younger version of me talked about that, right? The idea is, normative ethical questions are one kind of norm, and they do, I hope, to the extent that you are not a sociopath, I hope that morality matters to you, but none of us is like, what should I do? I'm at a crossroads. Oh, that's the right thing to do. Oh, I guess I'll do that. Like, that's not how life works. Life is more complicated than that, in the sense that there are other normative considerations. We talked about some, right? Legal norms are an example, right? They can come apart from moral norms. The legal should is different from the moral should, if you recall, right? So, now approach a situation, an actual situation, where you're wondering whether or not you should have an abortion. Well, you might think it's moral, or you might think it's immoral to have one, but you might also have to think about what the laws are in your state. All right? And that's going to determine whether or not you think you should have one. You might think about self-interested norms. What's good for you? Is it the right kind of thing? I can tell you from experience that it's a big sacrifice being a parent. All right? I mean, I love it. I don't think the sacrifice is the right word, but it's a big job. It's a big obligation, as my kid sleeps up there right now, and I wait for him to wake up. It's a big, obligation. And so it's from a self-interested standpoint, it's complicated, right? Think about your duties to your friends. Think about your duties to your coworkers, right? And so you can imagine a situation where you have to sort of figure out what you should do, all things considered, where the moral consideration about whether it's right or wrong is just one normative thing pulling on you among many other legal norms, social norms, self-interested norms, norms related to your coworkers, professional norms, and so on and so forth, right? And so the idea that we should have some sort of broad one-size-fits-all policy where you just say it's always wrong, never do it, is misguided, right? And then who better to know how to make that decision, to weigh all the pros and cons? Well, there's the moral consideration, there's the legal consideration, there's the self-interested consideration. Who better to make that decision than the pregnant women themselves? It's obvious, right? Only they're going to be in the best position to know what to do, right? And so that the idea is that's why it should be left up to the woman. It's because life is complicated. Morality is part of life, but it's not the only part of life. And so everybody has to know how to act given all the complexities of life. And in the case of an abortion, it's probably more complex than usual because you have to think about the life of this child. Well, who better to know how to navigate that? Okay, you get the point. And so the idea, right, is that society that we actually have, it doesn't actually do anything to make it any easier. So in other words, I'm just sort of reiterating what I said before, but here it comes up yet again. Anybody who's actually pro-life, if you were actually pro-life, then you would, if you wanted to outlaw abortion, you would, for example, want to beef up adoption services. You would want to increase the social safety net to decrease poverty. We have the largest, not one of, it's depressing. We have the largest rate of childhood poverty among developed nations. So we would do things like that, right? And increase funding for education so that this child has a good education. You would make sure that they have enough to eat, and so on and so forth, right? And so anybody who wants to say, well, it should be illegal and we're not going to do anything else, right, is a hypocrite. That's the idea. If you're actually pro-life, then have a set of policies that makes it so that you actually care about the child and shows that. Okay. So another interesting aspect of her view that I thought was useful is, the way that she responds to what I think is an obvious question here. And I think this is controversial, and I think it's, something that is worth thinking about. Maybe Sherwin's right about this, maybe she isn't. But, the way of thinking about it is, sure, I mean, having kids can be rough. Having an abortion can be rough or not, right? Depending on who you are. But anybody who has sex should know what they're getting into. Even if they have contraception, they should know that contraception isn't perfectly effective. And as long as you know the risks and you have sex anyway, right, then you have to live with the consequences. And that might include having to carry the child to term. You could see this kind of argument being for a pro-life-ish position, right? Well, her response is, that's sort of naive to say that women have a choice in sex, given sexual politics, right? Gender norms, women are promoted to be subservient and considerate of other feelings, conditioned, I should say, to do that ever since they're born. Given current gender norms, I think they're shifting a little bit, but you'd be able to speak more to that than I, whether that's true, right? And so we have a society, a patriarchic, society that promotes that, right? Promotes subservience and thinking about their feelings, okay? That's point number one. Another thing is, look, I don't know about you, but when, sex is something that's about to happen, is it like a kind of a premeditated thing?
So it's like, well, I've weighed the pros and cons, and I've decided that it's most rational for me to have sex with you, and so I'm wondering if you could sign here and have I'd have your consent, and then we could make this autonomous decision together. Is that how people hook up? No. Okay, that's not how it goes down, right? And so there's the context of sex is one where I think this happens in the heat of the moment. It's emotion, impulsive driven, things like that, right? It can happen that way anyway. Alcohol can be involved, and so on and so forth, right? And so this idea that it's a choice is naive, because a lot of pressure, a lot of emotion, and such is involved. And so this is where ought implies can makes an appearance, right? Remember, you can't blame somebody for doing what they had to do, right? Well, that comes on a spectrum. You can think of the sort of examples I gave of the insane person not guilty by reason of insanity. That's one extreme. The premeditated murder, that's the other extreme. Well, most human behavior falls in the middle, and I think sexual hookups are somewhere in the middle, where it's kind of impulsive, kind of premeditated or rational, for lack of a better term, and kind of not. So it's not a black and white obvious case where a choice is involved. There's a lot of, as I keep saying, pressure involved. And so that's why saying that it is, and that you should therefore be responsible for the context, is naive. It doesn't actually pay attention to how the actual psychology works. And, IUDs and birth controls, they have all a bunch of problems. They cause problem for women's health down the road. Condoms, of course, work, but they're awkward. Whether or not they're used, whether or not you have them on hand, whether or not they break, right, and so on and so forth. All of that stuff comes into play. It's not obviously a 100% barrier to having a child or preventing STDs, right? So for that reason, the best policy is to promote condom use, no IUDs or birth control because of what it does to women's health, but promote condom use and then have an early term abortion as a sort of fail-safe. That's what she thinks the best policy is. Okay, and the last thing, another thing that I think is somewhat controversial, like that last slide. Interested to know what you think about what she said about the choice issue, as I just argued on her behalf for. This as well, I also think this is interesting and controversial. When she talks about the feminist notion of a person. So you get this, and I know this is a sort of a big word here, you get this idea of personhood as something relational and socio-cultural rather than about metaphysical autonomy. So what I'm trying to get at here is of a piece with that patriarchic, of a piece with that patriarchic framing of things in terms of individual rights is a sort of view of the person as a kind of metaphysically autonomous thing. So metaphysics just relates to the nature of reality, and autonomy just means sort of self-legislating, right? And so the idea is that it's of the nature of the reality of a person that they are self-legislating. I am free, I can sort of float above my emotions, I can float above all the pressures, and I have this ability to make a rational, autonomous decision as this sort of atomized actor in the world. I'm separate from everybody else. I am my own person. I can pull myself up by my own bootstraps and take responsibility for myself, and I sort of act, therefore, independently of other people, pressures, and so on. That's the sort of metaphysical view. And you can kind of see how that relates to individual rights, property rights, again, just to make that connection. The idea is if I'm metaphysically autonomous, if the nature of the human person is to be self-legislating in this kind of atomized way that allows them to float free of everybody else, including social pressure, then if I autonomously and freely work for something, I deserve it, right? Then that's sort of the quick and dirty version of property rights, right? So as a feminist critique of that, she gives a interesting understanding of personhood as rather relational and socio-cultural. The idea is that you cannot understand what a person is independently of the the society and the culture and the broader systems of which they are a part. I mean, think of like an ecosystem, right? You can't think of what a predator is independently of what prey is. And there's a certain sense in which at the species level, predator species and prey species codepend on one another as part of that ecosystem. So you can see, right, it's rejecting the autonomous actor sort of floating free of everything on its own and acting in a way that allows it to be above the fray. And it's instead seeing us as inherently relational. Okay, and personhood is inherently relational. So the status of the fetus needs to be understood in that way, right? Those views that treat it as a matter of individual rights, they bestow upon this fetus this sort of ability to lie above the fray and be this person in and of itself. They give the same rights that they give an autonomous individual to a fetus. Right, and the argument that she says is that's foolish. Okay, the fetus is not an autonomous thing existing on its own. It's highly relational. Right, so the idea is that you can't do anything to a fetus, like help it or hurt it in a way that doesn't thereby affect the pregnant woman carrying it. Right. And so for that reason, treating the fetus as if it's an organism independent of that broader system, in this case, that relationship, not so much predator-prey, but, frankly, parasite-host, roughly speaking, right? It's something like that. You cannot understand its relationship independently of that kind of relationship, and for that reason, right, it has to have rights that are given to it accordingly. And so there's no sort of, the interesting view is there's no sort of theory where it's like this is an entity with its own rights, sort of floating free of reality in the way I keep saying, that's in line with this idea of being metaphysically autonomous. Again, don't let that word, I keep using it, intimidate you. It just means the nature of the reality of the self is you are sort of self-legislating, that's autonomous, and that means that allows you to be sort of an independent actor, right? Well, this view is denying that, and so then the idea is whatever value you have must be something that relates to the parasite-host kind of relationship that is typical of the pregnancy itself. And so a fetus will not have value independently of what the woman assigns to it. Now that can sound crass, right? But don't let the problems that you have with it involve smuggling in this kind of view, right? Because it's not saying that, for example, if a woman wanted to sort of just completely ignore it, she could, and pretend like it didn't have any value, then it wouldn't have any value. That's not what it's saying. Like, the whole idea is to define and understand the relationship in terms of that holistic, systemic ecosystem kind of way, right? And the idea would be, right, I mean, we don't need to get too involved in it because I think it's fairly clear. If you, for example, carried a fetus to term, one would imagine that you would assign it a great deal of value by virtue of having that particular relationship with it, right? But aside from the kind of relationship it gets within that context, it has none. That's the idea. It has no sort of autonomous value as a person, independently of any value it gets by virtue of its relationship in that overall system, which includes, of course, its relationship to its mother as host, if you will. Okay, so, Sherwin criticizes the opposing view because it says, well, if you just sort of treat the fetus as this autonomous person, this autonomous actor that has rights in and of itself, again, remember how that's downstream of that patriarchic framing of things, right? If you do it that way, then all you ever do is you talk about the rights that it has, and you say things like abortion is murder, and in doing so you just completely drop out any discussion of the fact that it's being carried by the woman. She becomes sort of irrelevant. It's all about the rights of the fetus, and you sort of ignore the way in which being a fetus depends on and affects the mother carrying it, right? So you can see how that's of a piece with that patriarchic way of thinking about things, where we sort of, if you had an overall misogynistic culture, which we essentially do, for, reasons that we can discuss at length, and I've only just scratched the surface here, then you would, in talking about the abortion debate, just completely ignore women. And that's exactly what happens. Another way of sort of making that clear is, these days, in the way that the issue is framed, you oftentimes hear people frame it as, well, what about abortion in the case of rape or incest, or when the mother's life is threatened, right? Well, if you make sort of the debate framed in those terms, right, then you make it seem like, well, abortion is only allowed in these kinds of extreme cases of rape, incest, or when murder is involved. If you make those the sort of cases that you're worried about, that's how it gets framed. It's like, it's such a bad thing that it would only ever be allowed in those extreme cases. Whereas if you're framing things in terms of the caring about the mother and how she feels, right, as the one responsible for the fetus, right, then you would imagine, you'd have a broader discussion about, well, what about abortion in cases where it's something that conflicts with that woman's sense of her own well-being? What if it makes her family life hard? What if it makes her professional life hard? What if it takes away from her obligations to her friends? What if it takes away from her obligations to herself, right? And so when you broaden the debate and you have a discussion about things in the way that Sherwin wants to, you include those considerations as well. And then that's where you get back to this idea of, the because of all those complexities, the pregnant woman herself being the one that should have the say. Whereas if you're thinking about things in this way, right, you sort of don't even talk about her at all. That's the sort of point she's making, is that that's what's problematic about defenses like this that operate with this mistaken view of personhood and ignore the relational view of personhood. I hope that's clear. And, a sort of striking example of that, I think, and she's good at pointing this out, is you will hear people say there's no moral difference between a late-term abortion and infanticide, where you kill the infant after it's been born. And you can see how the only way you would ever make that sort of argument is if you were framing things in a way that made it so that the woman completely dropped out of moral consideration. Because there's an obviously huge difference between a late-term abortion and infanticide, because in one case, the fetus is still in her body, right? And it's still, in that sense, before it's born, dependent upon her in a way that it's not when it's an infant outside of the womb. Of course, when they're infants, they still depend on their mothers, but not in the same one-on-one way that they do when they're pregnant, because if the gestational mother doesn't care for the infant, somebody else still can. Okay, so I hope that's all helpful. Again, just to sort of recap what I'm trying to do here, and I hope it got clear, is I didn't focus so much on the morality of individual acts of abortion. I do think there is a debate to be had there. There is a debate to be had over a pro-life, staunchly pro-choice, or a more moderate position. I think when you do sort through those arguments, the most plausible position is a more moderate one, which says that sometimes abortion is okay and sometimes it's not on particular occasions. But that's controversial, and I'm pointing that out. But I thought, in light of the sort of imminent overturning of Roe, it would be more useful, and also because of what I want to do in the class as a whole, it would be more useful to frame this discussion in terms of the relationship between the morality of individual acts and questions of social justice and how to frame society as a whole. And so that's what I tried to give you here. Now, in the context of that, I don't think that a lot of what I said is controversial, and I didn't provide the opposing side, because what I don't think is controversial is that the women's liberation movement is a good thing. And I do think that misogyny is very real. If you have any doubts about that, I can give you more information, but I bet some of you know from experience. And so that was not what was controversial at all. And I didn't present the opposing side of that, because if you look at the opposing side, which sort of denies the existence of the oppression of women in the United States, or denies the existence of institutionalized misogyny, if you look at the arguments for those claims, they're just not there. The reality is different. So I didn't present that as a controversy, because I think it's a fact that the rights of women have been historically oppressed in this country, and they've gotten better since the 1960s and the women's liberation movement. But I did want you to contextualize this imminent overturning of Roe as a uncontroversially problematic rollback of those rights, and I want you all to be on guard for that happening, because it's happening right now in the states that I mentioned in the South, and in the potential political future that we have, which will result in an abortion ban potentially and more. That's not like conspiratorial or speculation. It will happen if the elections go a certain way. And I just want to point out that that would be a regression in our society, not a progression. And if you disagree with that, you need to get your head out of your ass. And then the other thing I wanted to say was a couple things about Sherwin's particular arguments, some of which I do think are controversial, because you can think of, women's liberation and dealing with misogyny in our culture as a problem, but we can disagree about how to solve that problem or how to contextualize that problem. And she has a feminist way of contextualizing it and understanding it, and that is controversial. There are other ways to think about it, and I tried to get at a couple different ways in which it is controversial. One is this idea, I think, of the choice not being there given sexual politics. I think that's sort of potentially controversial. I'd like to know what you think about that. And this notion of personhood is interesting and controversial. I'd like to know what you think about that. If, for example, you think this goes through, and why. Okay. And so that hopefully is useful and will give you some insight on what's going on right now, so that you know how you can address this all too recent moral issue. All right, that's all. Take care.